Hey guys, Caleb here, and welcome back to another video. In this one, we're going to talk about everything you need to know about camera rigging, different parts, categories, things you may have never heard of when it comes to taking a camera and rigging it out for video. A couple things before we dive into our first category of parts, and that is that I'm going to have a blog post with a ton of different links, different categories, images, all of that stuff. So you can check that out in the link in the description. And if you haven't already, check out my perfect camera rig video. There you'll kind of see my methodology. I like to be able to have the camera with a minimal setup, be able to add and remove handles, monitors, and other accessories very quickly. And so that's kind of my methodology going into all of this. So with that out of the way, let's dive into our first category of gear when it comes to rigging, and that is camera cages. Camera cages like the one on this GH5S are great because they allow you to mount a bunch of stuff to the camera without building it up too much. And there are a ton of different features and models and brands, but the couple of things I would recommend you look out for is number one, get a cage that is fitted for your camera. There's a bunch of really bulky, nasty cages out there. I recommend getting one that's designed specifically for your camera. So this is a Tilta cage, and as you can see, it's going to perfectly fit our A7S III. You can also get these instead of a full cage like this one that wraps fully around the camera. You can get a half cage or C cage, which I am very partial to because it keeps the bulk and weight down and still gives you a ton of different features. Another thing to look out for is what the cage can do for you. For example, this one has a 15mm rod attachment point on the front. It has a built-in NATO rail, and we'll talk about all of this here in a little bit. And there is a rosette attachment point here, as well as a ton of 1/4 and 3/8 threads all over it. Our next category of rigging is going to be quick release plates and clamps. This is going to allow you to quickly remove your camera from the rig or your entire rig from a tripod. Now there are a ton of different standards out there from Manfrotto, Arca Swiss, there's just so many. I have decided to go with the Arca Swiss standard because it is very popular and there are a ton of different manufacturers and options. So it's a great way to go. I've converted everything to Arca Swiss. So as an example, here is a video tripod and it uses a Manfrotto style plate, but I have added this Arca Swiss clamp to the top so that I can simply take my Arca Swiss cameras and lock them down in place. So it's a great way to go. You can convert everything to whatever standard you want. I'm going to be talking about Arca Swiss and the basics of quick releases. So at the end of the day, there's two parts to a quick release system. We have the plate itself. Here I have a giant, super long one, and the clamp. There's several different versions of each of these. So if we look at plates, you can get them in several different sizes. Like this one here is a really, really long one with several ways and points to mount your camera. This allows you to slide the entire camera system or rig system on a tripod and perfectly balance things out. So we've got that giant plate. Here is one that I use quite a bit, kind of your standard style. And then here is a microscopic, super tiny Arca Swiss plate. So there's several different ways to go, different features with your plates, but at the end of the day, you mount this to the bottom of your camera or rig, and then you can quickly release it from the clamp, which is the second part. Here's a very simple version, so I can simply drop in my plate and tighten it down with this knob on the side. And that's really all there is to it. Here's another style of quick release clamp. This one's much more expensive. It is the Kessler Quick Plate, but I love these things. So I have a locking lever here. And what's cool about this particular plate is that it is a single-handed action and a drop-in. So I can take my plate, just imagine this is a camera, drop it in and it'll click in place. Now it's not going to move around. It's locked in place. And I can now use the locking lever to finish off that locking mechanism. There's also specialty style Arca Swiss plates. So this is another Kessler plate. And you can see here it has a standard quick release plate, but there's these feet going off to the side. This means that you can drop your entire rig on a tripod and use it as you normally would, or you can set your entire rig on the table and it's not going to scratch up any surfaces because of those rubber feet. And it also won't flop around back and forth because you've got a nice wide footprint for your entire rig. Another cool feature with Arca Swiss is that there are little locking knobs, or rather screws, on either end of the plate. This means when I add my quick release plate to my quick release clamp, Even if I don't tighten this knob down all the way, when the plate hits the end, it won't completely fall off. So your camera system won't go crashing to the floor. It will not be removed, and then you can securely lock it in place with the knob. So it's just an added safety feature. You don't have to worry about things accidentally falling off your tripod. Our next category of gear is going to be base plates. These are kind of the heart of your system. They're just about as important as your camera cage. So what do these things do? Well, here I have a very, very simple one. And essentially you have an area on the top to mount your cage or your camera, and on the bottom you have methods of mounting a quick release plate. And you could add a quick release clamp to the top, which I have a setup like that right here. It's the same base plate right here in the middle, but I've got a quick release clamp here so I can add my camera on and off super quickly and easily. And then on the bottom I've got a quick release plate so I can take the entire rig and drop it on a tripod. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility, and it has 15mm attachment points here and here. So I'll grab another one here. This is a slightly different style. We've got 15mm holes on either side with locking knobs. This allows you to use 15mm rods with your rig and build up all kinds of different stuff. Minimal rigs, giant rigs, whatever. But it all starts right here with your base plate. Just as an example, here's another more beefy base plate. This one has, more features. So we've got some rosettes, which we'll talk about in a little bit, more mounting points on the top and bottom. So that covers the humble base plate. Now let's get into 15mm rods, which are kind of another foundation of rigging. It's a great way to expand your setup and customize it. So here I have several different 15mm rods. First, let's talk about length. There's several different sizes. I usually end up going with something between a 6-inch and a 12-inch for most setups. You can get really, really long ones like this. The next thing you want to pay attention to is the material of the 15mm rod. If you want to keep your rig super lightweight, you might want to go with a carbon fiber rod. These are going to be very, very lightweight, but not as strong, and they may have some flex when you put a lot of weight on them. So then you want to go with something like aluminum, or even better, steel or stainless steel. So this is one of the strongest rods I have. There's also some specialty rods or rods with some additional features. So one type of rod has a threaded insert, or there is threading on the inside of the rod. So you can take things like this little cap here and thread it into the rod. Now, when I take something like my base plate and add the rod, even if it's not locked in, it's not going to slip off of the base plate. You can also get connectors or extenders to extend your rods even longer than they are out of the box. And then there's two other styles that are commonly used. One is called a cheese rod. So here we have a 15mm rod, but there's a 1/4, 20, and 3/8 taps throughout the rod. So you could add this to your rig and extend a bunch of gear and mount stuff to those threads. Another cool style of 15mm rods is these guys, which have little taps in them. So you could add a piece of gear to the end of this, like a cold shoe. So that covers 15mm rods. Let's talk about 15mm accessories. So here on the table, I have a ton of different 15mm attachments, adapters, and all kinds of crazy stuff. It might look intimidating, but all you need to know is that this is using the 15mm standard in either a dual 15mm mode, like this particular 15mm clamp, or a single 15mm clamp or adapter. One of the #1 pieces of 15mm gear that I use all of the time is this guy right here. This is a simple 15mm clamp. There's a spot for 2 rods and a bunch of tapped points and through holes. And in short, a through hole allows you to stick a screw through the hole. And then we have tapped points or threaded points, which allow you to thread something into the adapter or whatever you're working with. I absolutely love this particular 15mm clamp because you can bolt it from any direction and mount anything to anything else and use the 15mm rod standard. So it's a great, great little tool. And we have ratcheting knobs on the side, which is really important. So what you can do is you can tighten it down, and then if you reach the end of the tightening point, you want to go a little further, you can pull out the knob, reposition it, and keep tightening it. Or if you have this thing mounted and the knob is just sticking out at a weird angle where you just don't want it, you simply grab it, twist it, and now it's out of the way. You want to go for that if at all possible, because the alternative is fixed knobs. So once this is tight, that's where it's going to live. I can't move it anymore. Like I said, there are a billion different types of 15mm adapters, but there's a couple that I really dig. One particular setup is these through hole adapters. So essentially we have a way to add a bolt and just add a 15mm clamp anywhere on your rig. And there's several different shapes and sizes and angles, and these are fantastic. Another great accessory are these 15mm blocks that have 1/4, 20 taps and 3/8 taps, which is a great way to add anything to any part of your rig. And then we have special adapters like this one, which allow you to change the angle of the 15mm rod setup, or this cool thing, which has a cheese plate that rotates on a 15mm attachment that you can tighten down. Here I have a 15mm lens support, so you can add this to your rods and support a lens above it. And here is a simple 90-degree adapter, so you can add a rod here, attach this whole thing to your rig, and then take something like this 15mm handle and add that to the end, and now you've got a nice shoulder rig setup. There's 15mm shoulder pads, battery plates, and so much more to explore there. Now we're going to talk about one of my favorite pieces of rigging, and that is the NATO system. The NATO system is made up of kind of two different components. You have NATO rails and NATO attachments or accessories or clamps. So essentially the way this works is we have our NATO rail. They come in several different sizes. So here you can see I've got a really long one and a really short one. You can take accessories like this little 1/4, 20 tapped accessory, and I can essentially mount it to the end here, and now it'll slide and I can lock it in place at any point on the rail. Now it's not going to go anywhere. But what's really cool is there is a quick release mechanism and a lock mechanism. So on the end here, you'll notice these little brass tabs. You can push them in, and when they're just sitting there, if this gets loose somehow, it won't leave the NATO rail. It'll hit that little brass pin and it will stop. It's kind of like a safety lock. To release the NATO system, you simply push down on that pin with your finger and your attachment comes off just like that. Here is another little NATO rail attachment with a through hole, so you can add a bolt. You could bolt a monitor or something else to this. Here's another NATO clamp with a nice locking lever, and it has a ton of through holes and 1/4, 20s and 3/8 taps on it. But one of my favorite things to do is take NATO handles and mount them to the top or side of the camera. So here I have a simple NATO handle. I can add that to this NATO rail, and wherever I want it, I can lock it in place. Tons of mounting points on this, and we'll talk about handles in a little bit. Often your camera cage will also have NATO rails built into it so that you can grab various accessories and attach them directly to the cage without the need for an additional NATO rail. So the NATO system allows you to mount things like top handles, monitors, side handles to your rig and quickly remove them, so you can kind of customize these different modules for your camera setup, which I just love. Our next category of gear is cheese plates. These are so handy, and there's so many different ways to use them. So here on the table I have a whole bunch of different styles. We've got really long and skinny little cheese plates. We've got giant heavy duty cheese plates. And at the end of the day, a cheese plate is simply a metal plate with a ton of attachment points on it. So here's one of my favorite plates, and you'll notice that we have a lot going on here. We've got a 1/4 inch, we've got 3/8, we've got the ARRI locking system, which we'll talk about a little later. We have through holes, so you could bolt this to something. And one of my favorite features that I would recommend you look for in a cheese plate is that it has side taps. So you can see on the side of the plate, we have all these mounting points. So what could we do with this? Well, I could take this guy, our 15mm clamp, and since this has taps on the bottom of the plate, I could simply mount it like this. And now I have a giant plate that I could attach to my camera rig, put battery plates on this, all kinds of different stuff. Or I could mount it like this. Or since this particular 15mm clamp is so versatile, I could mount it like this. There's so many different ways to attach all of this. So that is the larger style plate that I really dig. Here's another one that's kind of got a different pattern on it. Here's one of my favorites as well. You can see I've had this for a long time. A smaller plate. This is a nice kind of medium size. Here's one that's kind of rounded that also has those side taps. This one's more like a tiny cheese post, but really handy to have and be able to mount different things. And finally, here's another really simple one. It's got some through holes and a ton of little taps all around this particular cheese block. So another really, really nice one to use. If you want to see some really cool uses for cheese plates and all of this gear, check out my custom rig playlist where I've built several rigs and used a lot of cheese plates. Next up, we have the wonderful world of cold shoes. Just like the hot shoe on your camera, a cold shoe is a very simple way to mount gear to each other. A lot of modern camera cages will have cold shoes built directly into the cage, but if you want to add more or move them around or have some additional functionality, there are a lot of accessories that you can add. So here in my hand, I've got 3 different cold shoe adapters, and there are several different ways to mount them. So this particular one is a very simple through hole adapter. So you would send a screw through the middle and bolt it onto your cage or something else. This one has a thread in the center instead of a through hole. And this one has 2 different mounting points, making sure it won't rotate on you, which is really nice. You can get a cold shoe offset where it moves the cold shoe for you, or check out the wonderful world of cold shoe extenders. This particular one takes a single cold shoe and adapts it to 2 cold shoes. This very simple adapter does the same thing, single cold shoe to a tray of cold shoes that you can use. And then here is just a giant cold shoe extender if you wanted to mount like 16 flashes. And finally, here's one of my favorites, a very simple 1, 2, 3 cold shoe little block, which is just really handy to have and use. While cold shoes aren't my favorite method of attaching gear, it is really handy if you just want to, say, move a microphone to the side of your camera rig. You could essentially bolt it right there onto your cage and now have your microphone off to one side. So things like that are where cold shoes are really great. Next up, we have the rosette system, which is a really strong, versatile way to mount gear and adjust gear. So here I have a rosette plate, and as you can see, there is a female thread on this particular one and teeth going all the way around. That's the first part of the rosette system, female thread with the teeth. Here's the second part. We've got a male thread with a locking knob and those same teeth. They attach together. You tighten up your accessory to the other side of the rosette. And when those teeth match, man, that's not going anywhere. But if you need to, you can very quickly adjust the angle of your rosette. There are a ton of different standards out there, but I'd recommend sticking with the ARRI standard, and you can find a lot of gear online. Just make sure it says ARRI locking rosette or something like that. Here I have several rosette receivers with different mounting options. So this particular one has through holes, so you could bolt this to a cage or something else. This one has a 15mm rod attachment point, so you just slide this on your rods and have a nice handle or something. This is a bolt-on with some captive screws, so you could add that anywhere. This is one of my favorites. It's got a rosette attachment point and a NATO clamp, so I can simply take a camera cage, mount this to the side of the NATO, and add a handle here, and if I need to adjust the height, it's that easy. Or if I just want to remove it completely, I could do that too. Here I have 2 different size 15mm rod, 2 NATO attachments. You can of course get handles like this nice leather one that would thread directly into that, and then you could adjust your handle angle. Here's a rosette arm, so you could mount that to something and extend your rosette and have another point of adjustment. And there are a ton of rosette handles, a straight handle like you see here. This is a really nice wooden rosette handle for the left hand that is set up for your fingers. Really nice. And this is a Tilta handle with a control for a wireless follow focus, and it has power outputs and a place to put your battery with a rosette attachment point as well. Next we have the ARRI locking accessories or system. So we're gonna start by looking at the top of this giant cage here. And you'll notice that there are a couple points where there's kind of a circle with tiny little circles or pins, holes around it. That's the ARRI locking system. Now you can take a handle or a cage or whatever has those receivers and add gear that has a 3/8 thread and 2 little pins. So this particular accessory is a monitor friction mount, which I love and we'll talk about here in a second. But essentially I can take this, drop it in, and tighten it down, and now this accessory is not going anywhere. This is one of the strongest connections when it comes to rigging with the gear we're talking about, because you have those 2 pins going into your camera cage or whatever accessory, so it won't rotate at all, whereas a cold shoe or some other attachments can unscrew itself. This cannot because of those two locking pins. These days you'll find this standard everywhere, not only on cages, but on cheese plates. You see a bunch here in the center. You can find them on top handles and side handles. Here's a bunch on this particular one here. So it's one of the strongest connections you can make. Personally, I prefer the NATO system because you can quickly remove things instead of having to sit here unscrewing that thing that I just added. So take that with a grain of salt. This is stronger, but I really do prefer the NATO system. And that brings me to these monitor mounts, which I just swear by. They're so, so good. So essentially you've got a little knob here that you can attach to a monitor like you see here. And now you can attach this to your camera or your camera cage and just simply grab your monitor and change the angle and it will stay in place. These essentially now replace your ball heads, which are really annoying because you have to have kind of two hands to be able to loosen it, adjust the monitor, and lock it back in place. Whereas with these monitor mounts, you can essentially attach the monitor, easily remove this entire thing in one go, and with one hand, adjust the angle of your monitor. These monitor mounts come in several different attachment points. So we've got cold shoe here, the ARRI locking system, NATO, which is by far my favorite, and then finally through hole with just a simple way to add some bolts and attach this thing to your cage or camera. Next up, we have the wonderful world of handles. There's so many different varieties out there. All you really need to do is figure out where the handle is going to be and how you want to attach it. For example, this is a simple top handle. It has two mounting through holes. So the idea is you put this on top of your camera and now you can pick it up and move it around. Super, super simple. This is a 15mm handle kind of designed for a shoulder rig style setup. Same kind of handle here, but with a rosette attachment point. Here's a wooden side handle for the left side of the camera. And here's a cool handle that can be used as a top handle or a side handle. And you can loosen this knob and adjust the angle. So I can rotate this whole thing to the other side. Really cool little handle. Then there are specialty handles like this behemoth beast mode handle that is just a monster with tons of attachment points, and it even has a quick release system so that I can remove it from its own base plate. So this would go on the top of your camera and give you two additional 15mm above your camera, which is kind of cool. And then you could simply, take the handle, drop it in, and adjust the distance of the handle from the plate. Here are two super cute, adorable, compact handles. This one is probably the smallest one you can find if you want just a really compact, lightweight handle. It simply mounts via two through hole bolts. And then this is probably my favorite handle of all time. It's not the cheapest, but it is really nice because it's small, it fits beautifully in the hand, it has a NATO attachment point, which is my favorite, and I really like this flat spot right here where I can add another NATO clamp for a monitor. Just a lot of flexibility with such a small handle. Then there are of course some really wild ones like this, which is kind of an L shape and has a NATO clamp here so that I can mount it to the top of my camera like this. And now I've got a really nice side handle to complement my right hand, and it works really great. And if I need to get rid of it, I simply loosen this knob and the whole thing slides right off. Now let's talk about the most common mounting hardware that you're going to come across and probably need. One of the most common types of bolts or screws are what I call tripod screws, and they come in 1/4 or 3/8 with either a flat knurled top or a D-ring, which allows you to flip this guy up and tighten it by hand. There's also these 1/4 to 3/8 adapters, which will essentially change the thread size of your screws. These are the most common through hole screws, the pan style and this kind of Torx style. They both pretty much do the same thing. This one is lighter and cheaper. This one is more heavy duty, and because of the tall side walls here, you get a little better bite and mounting power. These button screws are great for going through something into something else, like this 15mm rail block. You just drop it right in, and now I can bolt into a cheese plate or something else. And there are tons of different lengths of all of these screws, but really if you're going to be buying either of these particular items, a cheese plate or a 15mm rail block or clamp, you're probably going to get a bunch of this stuff with it. That said, you can also buy these screws on their own. Now let's talk about arms, specifically monitor or friction style magic arms. There's a bunch out there, In short, there's really the most popular size and style, which is an 11-inch or a 7-inch, sometimes even shorter monitor arms. These are great because you can simply open them up, adjust them, and have a lot of flexibility as to where your monitor ends up. And then when you're in a good spot, you just lock it down in place. There's a lot of nasty, cheapo versions of these, but in short, I found that the ones with these silver ends, I think SmallRig and some other brands make them, seem to be better. There are also these ball style arms, and these are cool because they're really strong and very versatile. They hold a lot of weight, so you're able to move everything around, and then when you're in a happy spot, you just lock it down. Another nice thing about these, specifically the SmallRig brand, is you can get different attachment points. This particular one goes from a NATO clamp to a NATO clamp. I think it might be discontinued, which stinks, but you can get all kinds of different versions of these, which is great. This is another version, but just with a straight 1/4 to 1/4. Not quite as well made, but it'll get the job done, and you might have things rotate on the ends, but not bad. Now let's talk about matte boxes. I've owned a lot of these, and honestly, at the end of the day, I just don't think you should buy them or they're worth it for most people. Yes, there are some people who really do need a matte box, but let's be honest, they look really, really cool. So here I have just a kind of a affordable, SmallRig matte box, but really I never use it. So I would recommend instead you go with something way more minimal, which I have right here and have used for years. The first is going to be a filtration system, specifically one that has magnets. So you add one of these adapters to your camera lens and the other to your filter, and now it just simply magnetically snaps into place. A great way to switch out filters quickly. And then a great accessory is this eyebrow flag from Dinkum Systems. As you can see here, it's just a nice small eyebrow. They have a larger version as well. And it has these easy to adjust arms that squeak horribly because this one's really old. And it has a cold shoe attachment on the end. So you can simply take this and mount it to your camera. And now you can very easily adjust the angle of the flag or the eyebrow to block light. Next, we're going to talk about power sources. There's several different options, including using the battery that's inside of your camera, using USB or power delivery over USB-C. But when it comes to using battery plates, there's really two popular options: V-mount or gold mount, like this giant battery here, or this smaller MPF style Sony battery. These are often used with lights and monitors, so they're super versatile. When it comes to using MPF style batteries, there are a lot of plates available on the market. Some are very simple, like this one, which will send a cable with a dummy battery to your camera. You can then bolt this onto a cage or a cheese plate like we've talked about before. You add the battery, and it even has an additional DC output for something like a monitor. This is a slightly nicer version from Tilta with a nice quick release pin and several different mounting options on the back. Then we have a DC output here, as well as on the other side a 12-volt output, which is really cool. Here is the same plate concept, but this particular one has your outputs on the side and a place to mount a quick release plate and your actual camera. So you could just mount this whole thing underneath your camera, which is pretty cool. When it comes to using these big V-mount batteries, there are a ton of plates. This is kind of your boring, normal plate. It just has a single D-tap on the side here. We can do a lot better than this. Here is a similar plate. We've got 15mm adjustable clamp on the bottom, but more importantly, on the side, we have a D-tap. We have a 12-volt conversion, 7.2 conversion volts for your camera, and a 5-volt adapter. So you could power all kinds of different devices from this single battery plate. Here is a small form factor version of the plates. You can see it's much smaller than this big guy right here, which works really, really well if you're going to be using miniature V-mount batteries. Like this little guy, you can see how much smaller this thing is, which is great for smaller handheld rigs. And here's what that small battery looks like on this small plate, which has a ton of D-taps on the back to be able to adapt to anything else. It also conveniently has a USB jack on the side. And here's an even smaller plate. This thing is absolutely tiny. It has slightly different connection options, and you can check out my A7S rig to see what this little guy is all about, but probably my favorite plate right now. You can see here that the plate is actually smaller than the actual battery. For an even simpler and more compact option, you can get these V-mount plates. So there's no electronics. It will simply take your battery and allow you to mount it to different things. So really great way to go if you don't need a bunch of adapters or power options and you just want to use the cable options on your battery. Here are two even smaller versions of these V-mount attachments. And you can even get one of these guys that is attached to a clamp. Next, let's talk about cables. First, we have dummy batteries. These are very simply a fake battery with a cable attached so that you can run power into your camera from an external source. If you're using a large V-mount battery, you can get D-tap cables like this one. That's what they look like, the plug that goes into your battery or battery plate. And on the other end, you have all kinds of different adapters like this DC barrel, very simple for plugging into a dummy battery for your camera or a light or really anything else. This cool adapter will take a D-tap and convert it into another D-tap and a USB on the other side, so great little tool. This cable takes a single D-tap and turns it into 4 D-taps, and there are tons of other cable options for V-mounts. And then this is a good old-fashioned barrel-to-barrel DC cable. You can get these in all kinds of different lengths and connector sizes and whatnot. Whenever you're dealing with power cables, make sure that the voltage is going to work. So some cables will have a little box inside of them that will take the voltage of your battery and convert it to whatever you need. Like this cable, which goes from a higher voltage D-tap to USB, and you'll see there's a little box here in the middle with some circuitry to kind of do that for you. But you really want to make sure that you're sending the correct voltage to something like your camera. You don't want 14.4 volts going to your camera. That's too high. So make sure your cable is converting voltage if you need that. Then we have HDMI cables. There's a couple that I really dig. One option is these hyper thin cables that I've used a lot and they work really great. You can get different connectors. This is probably my favorite HDMI cable for rigging because it has reversed and opposite angled HDMI connectors so that you can plug in your monitor at any angle. The only problem is it only goes up to 1080p. There's also a ton of these amazing monoprice cables, which are fantastic and totally worth checking out. And then we have a bunch of specialty cables like this, an HDMI to HDMI that can be bolted to the side of your cage. So you could use something like a cable lock accessory for your camera cage and this guy, and now you have a rock solid connection, which is great. And finally, these little HDMI adapters are super handy to have. You can get different angles to be able to convert, your cable from your monitor to your camera or vice versa, and just route your camera more neatly. When it comes to managing those cables, there's several little accessories that I use all of the time. The first is a good old-fashioned bongo tie. These are great for wrapping around cables and cages and all kinds of good stuff there. You can buy big rolls of this double-sided Velcro and cut it down to smaller strips or really small strips, and I use this all the time to strap cables down to my camera cage. And finally, one of my favorite hacks is to get these like screw down cable ties, if you will, and then take a tiny bolt, and you can bolt this to your cage and simply thread or snap the cable into it and route your cables neatly around your cage. And you can of course make several different sizes of these. So I know that was a ton of information and parts, but if you want to see a lot of this stuff used to build actual camera rigs, you can check out a playlist that I've created with all of the rigs I've built over the years. If you want to learn more about any of the particular items that we may have mentioned or different categories, check out that link in the description where I'll have a page with everything laid out. So that's going to wrap up this video. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you in the next video.